The full value of goods and services is totaled up each quarter, resulting in what we fondly refer to as
GDP.
That's right.
But the system works pretty well for developed nations. But when you look for data on developing nations such as Somalia, Liberia, even Iraq, there isn't any.
Professor Vernon Henderson is part of a team at Brown University's Department of Economics that's looking for alternative ways of measuring GDP. They are seeing the biggest results from way up in outer space. And there he is, live from Brown's campus in Providence, Rhode Island. Welcome to you.
Good to be here.
So how on earth, I couldn't resist that, did you get the idea to do this kind of study?
Well, I'm study urbanization in developing countries, and we just don't have measures of income and of economic growth at the city level in developing countries. And one of my co-authors was more interested at the national level, and the fact that, say, in African countries, GDP is very badly measured and growth is very badly measured. So we were looking for some measure that's available for the whole world and that's available on a regular basis.
Dr. Henderson, where did you find the most dramatic results? Were they in sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, we did different studies. So in one of the things we looked at was the impact of rainfall on agriculture and then that impact on city growth. And those results are fairly dramatic for Africa. In terms of pictures, I mean, you can look at some areas of the world and see, growth through lights, the brightening of lights, and then see in other parts of the world either potentially a dimming of lights where there's been a loss of income.
And we're looking at video, I believe, of Africa, but you also have some interesting photos out of Eastern Europe from 1992 versus 2002.
Right.
Hopefully we can show you those, but if we have a delay here, explain the difference that you see.
Well, what you see in the former Soviet republics is really a dimming of lights. And in 92, they're fairly bright. By 2003, they're much dimmer. Where if you look in Eastern Europe, in particular in Poland and Romania, you see this really intense growth of lights. And that reflects, in fact, what we know happened, that there was this loss of income and negative economic growth in the former Soviet republics and this rather good growth in Eastern Europe.
And if you would compare the light that we just saw from Eastern Europe in those time periods and put it toward the United States, the U.S. would probably be off the spectrum.
The U.S. would be off the spectrum. That's particularly along the coastal areas. Very, very brightly lit, obviously. Right.
So then how are you measuring this? In GDP we measure in 1%, 2% growth. So if you take the whole world from your study or from your, how are you categorizing it?
Well, what we're doing a similar measure. We're really, in some sense, using lights to predict the economic growth that we see, and then also using our growth in lights as an alternative measure of income growth. And there's a statistical way to link the two. So we get both a kind of an alternative measure of economic growth that's really the growth in lights, and then we get a combined measure that maybe gives us an improved estimate of economic growth.
Professor Henderson, let's talk a bit about the role agriculture plays in your findings.
Okay, agriculture is not. So if you're in the U.S., much of the agricultural areas are not well lit, and we don't have many people working in agriculture in the U.S., so it doesn't show up a lot. And what really does show up is the coastal areas, and so when lights grow, that's reflecting growth in these cities and urban centers. If you go into the developing world, there's a lot more people in agriculture. It's much more densely populated in agricultural areas, and there you can see as agriculture improves, you can see an increase in lights in areas where there's concentrations of people.
So how do you see your research helping investors?
How is it helping investors? I don't know that yet.
Okay, so what's the next step then in your research? What do you want to look into next?
Well, I think that partly we put this out there to see what the reaction of the scientific community is and how economists feel about it as a measure of growth. And if that goes well and the response is good, I could see us looking to, we've had a lot of requests for applications in terms of an area that's done investment and they want to know how much they've grown.
Right.
They don't have any explicit income measure, so they'd like to know how the lights is growing.
Professor, I'm sorry, we're a little short on time. We're going to have to leave it there, but a fascinating study. J. Vernon Henderson, professor at Brown University, joining us from Providence.